Good morning. Welcome to the District 3 Cities meeting this morning. We have quite a treat for you. This morning's presentation will highlight a new book called Paved by Collin Yarbrough. I have a copy right here. And we'll have a very lively discussion with Commissioner John Wiley Price, Alberta Blair, and Dr. Janelle Smith Collin, who is a professor at SMU. Collin Yarbrough, he is a Dallas native, and he's a current PhD student at the SMU Lyle School of Engineering. His civil engineering PhD is focused on transportation systems. His research focus is the intersection of racial and environmental justice, infrastructure development, and community engagement. And interestingly enough, Collin also runs a nonprofit cookie bakery with his mother. It's called Full Circle. And again, he's recently published a book about infrastructure inequality in Dallas, Paved Away, Infrastructure Policy and Racism in an American City. And also presenting with him is Dr. Janelle Smith Collin. She's an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at SMU. She leads the Transportation Projects and Organizations Research Group, which focuses on sustainability and resilient infrastructure systems, transportation planning and human mobility, and engineering education. Her current research addresses equity in new transportation mobility technologies, examines the needs of the transportation disadvantaged and access to opportunities, and assesses connections between social equity and resilient infrastructure. Prior to starting her PhD, Dr. Smith Collin worked for a state Department of Transportation and Intermodal Systems Planning and in civil engineering consulting, and she is a professional engineer. So I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Price and let him introduce the speakers and have any opening remarks.
There's nothing I can say. I'm ecstatic today, elated. And as I was telling Collin earlier, and welcome Dr. Smith Collin, but I was telling him this is just a takeoff years ago. He's a good friend of mine. He's still living today, and his name is Claude Anderson. He wrote a book called Black Labor, White Wealth. And it really deals on infrastructure in terms of how it has separated our communities, created flyovers, talks about that whole economic delta. And so, in fact, we brought Dr. Anderson here. He doesn't do much speaking these days, but about a year ago for the Regional Black Contractors Association, because they had heard me speak so much about Black Labor, White Wealth. And I'm just saying I'm ecstatic. So there's really nothing I can add to what Lissa has already done in terms of introducing you guys. And so I want to get right into your presentation, give you all the time. As I said, I'm ecstatic. So with that being said, Collin, looks like you're on up at bat first, and it's called Paved Away. Wow. And so we're looking forward to it. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you, Commissioner Price. I will go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started.
And I want to make sure Bobby Lyle. Did I get Bobby Lyle? That's okay. I just thought I'd throw that in there. But anyway.
So I'm going to actually let Collin take over. Thank you, Commissioner Price, for the welcome. I'll jump off the camera and we'll rejoin for the Q&A portion. But thank you for the welcome. And you are in for a treat. Collin has done some great work.
Oh, I know. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. All righty. Good morning, everyone. My name is Collin Yarbrough, and today we'll be going through Some of the stuff that is covered in my book, Paved a Way, Infrastructure, Policy, and Racism in an American City. And that American city is, in this case, is Dallas. Apologies for the Dallas bias in the presentation today. I don't mean to throw shade at any of the other D3 cities, but that's been the focus of my work so far. So I want to start, before we begin, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are formal statements that recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. And so this is the occupied, unceded, stolen territory of the Caddo, Wichita, Kiowa, and Comanche, and others who stewarded this land for nearly 12,000 years since the Hassanai. These and other peoples experienced genocide and forced removal from the land now known as Texas. Their ancestors are present with us on this land and seek justice and healing for their people. We pay respects to elders both past and present. So today, or this morning, we'll cover a little bit of introduction, cover infrastructure, policy, and racism, what that looks like, cover a little bit of Indigenous history, and then kind of go into the more political and infrastructure underpinnings. And we'll take a look at one neighborhood, former neighborhood, the North Dallas neighborhood, and then we'll open it up. I'll lead into some remarks from Dr. Smith Collin, kind of bringing my historical stuff more into the present, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. My name is Collin Yarbrough. I grew up here in Dallas, in Lake Highlands, just north, inside 635 and 75. I went to undergrad in upstate New York, studying engineering and management. And I came back to Texas in 2012. And I've always considered myself a little inside the box and outside the box at the same time. I spent my early career working in the natural gas business as a pipeline engineer for Atmos Energy. And I worked there for 7 years, and my work basically spanned anything west of Irving. I am a licensed professional mechanical engineer, and when I left Atmos 2 years ago in 2019, I spent more time with the bakery that Lissa mentioned, and I'm currently a graduate student at SMU, pursuing a PhD in transportation systems in the civil engineering department. So to discuss race in Dallas or any city, we have to understand these interactions between infrastructure policy and racism. So, and as was mentioned, kind of my research focuses on the impacts of the built environment in either perpetuating or not perpetuating justice and equity in our cities, particularly along racial and economic lines, which in the US are highly correlated. And that's absolutely true in Dallas's context. And my journey in infrastructure started with unpacking the ways Black and Mexican American neighborhoods in Dallas were dismantled and erased by Dallas's highways, parks, and other infrastructure, and the ways white engineering and planning professionals who look a lot like me leveraged power and privilege to control not only the built environment, but political processes as well. So in terms of our discussion today, I'd like to focus on the elements where the built environment and civic infrastructure, public policy, and race intersect, because these intersections and interactions directly shape the environment around us. The built environment, as distinguished from, say, the natural environment, is anything that's human-made, surrounding you right now. Maybe you're sitting in a building, or you took a road to get to work, or somewhere this morning. It's the stuff that we live in and move around in, which supports human activity. And it differs from the natural environment because it has intent, has funding, and it has planning that humans inject into it to shape the world around us. On the other hand, we have civic infrastructure, and I like to think of this as these are the ways that we individually and collectively work to make a difference in civic life in our communities through political and non-political responsibilities like voting, neighborhood associations, PTAs, volunteering, all those kinds of things. And these actions of civic engagement are the tools that leverage community design and power to shape a more just built environment. And at the center of all these structures and interactions are the biases and systems of power and privilege which influence everything. So just to kind of have some definitions very clear of what we're talking about today, Congress has debated, what qualifies and what doesn't qualify as infrastructure this past year. So using the word infrastructure can be kind of a loaded term these days. So traditionally, infrastructure is the physical things we see. They're the most visible aspects of the built environment. And while they're visible, highly visible in many ways, we often are like fish in water. We use physical infrastructure constantly, and we sometimes lose sight of it because it's generally reliable in the US. And we don't really think about it much. Beyond highways, physical infrastructure can include water and sewer lines, public transit, parks, streets, power lines. And these are all elements of physical infrastructure which cultivate opportunities in our lives every day. Similar to physical infrastructure, civic infrastructure has components which we may not consider immediately. Civic infrastructure includes elements which support civic engagement, open forums, and public meetings at a city hall, policies, processes, representation, feelings of safety, cohesion, and inclusion, and things like voting. These are all the grease which keeps the wheels of democracy turning, and they're also the scaffolding which supports it. So now that we have some definitions in place, we'll start taking a few steps back in history. And before we can talk about the land we now know as Dallas, or even Texas, for that matter, we must back up and situate ourselves within the context of this land and the indigenous presence and subsequent genocide and removal from this land that paved the way for Dallas to exist at all. It's a story of land, resources, and genocide. So the European colonial presence began in the area now known as Texas, starting in the 1500s, with first the Spanish and then later the French. And I'm not going to go too in depth over this time period between the 1500s and the 1800s, but I just want to highlight the importance of, upon the arrival of the Spanish in the 1500s, the indigenous population in the area is estimated at 200,000, and that's kind of in the the North Texas area. And over the course of that 300-year period, up to the 1800s, when Texas became a republic in 1835, the indigenous population plummeted 95% to 10,000. This is largely due to smallpox, cholera, and other diseases that were introduced by the Europeans. And our discussion today is going to focus on kind of the Anglo presence in the area, which began around 1820s. So the Republic of Texas's second president, Yarbrough B. Lamar, led an administration that was fueled by a hatred for any non-Anglo presence, whether that was Tejano, African American, or indigenous. And the rhetoric at the time referred to them as, quote, wretched races. Indigenous people stood in the way of this expansionist ideology that was determined to gain control of land and fuel economic development by farming cotton with stolen labor. Farms in Texas were some of the largest in the country, which lured people to the state. And Lamar's administration was determined to, and I quote, to engage in extermination of all trespassing vermin on Texas soil. So this effort of genocide and extermination was a function of Texas policy in the Republic. So at that time, around the 1840s, there's a lot of money being made raiding and selling indigenous goods, and many people were enlisting to plunder and destroy indigenous villages, which created these really intense conditions along the advancing Anglo line pushing west. And this Battle of Village Creek, which is kind of in between Dallas and Fort Worth today, in May 1841, is kind of generally considered this kind of last stand, the last battle before the indigenous presence was pushed west and north, which cleared the way for Dallas's development. So General E.H. Tarrant assembled 70 men up near Sherman in early May 1841, and they trekked south, making their way down through some timber areas until they got to an area around this village, this Village Creek area. And several days in, they came across a village that had about 60 lodges, which at the time were deserted, and they destroyed them, so they couldn't be returned to. And as they continued trekking on, they stumbled onto another village, took fire. John Denton died in that skirmish. And this village was about a mile long, had 225 lodges occupied by scattered nations. A lot of those nations I mentioned in the land acknowledgement. Terrence Military Company stole cattle, horses, and other goods, and they returned in July with 400 rangers, and at that time the encampment was deserted. So this skirmish kind of marked the expansion of safe territory for Anglos and paved the way for John Neely Bryan, Dallas's founder, to settle 6 months later in November 1841. So when we talk about kind of the early political underpinnings of Dallas, a lot of that is focused on elite white control. So 1902 saw a statewide poll tax introduced, which was strongly opposed by people of color, populists, and unions. And it served to undermine the ability of lower income people of any race to participate in the elections process. 1903, another state law allowed the parties participating in elections to determine who could and could not vote in their primaries. And at this time, the Southern Democratic Party had a near stronghold on Dallas's political system, and they called for a whites-only primary, which effectively eliminated the black vote in Dallas. And at the time, Dallas was based on a kind of ward or alderman system initially, which is somewhat similar to the district system we have today, where representatives are elected based on their geographic area. But in 1906, this system was dissolved, and city representatives were elected at large. So there was no specific tie to geographic relationship, which further diluted the ability for people of color or marginal neighborhoods to elect representatives. And it was not until 1969 that Dallas saw the first Black and Mexican American representatives on city council, Anita Martinez and George Allen. And then further on into the 90s, after a very hard-fought battle by Henry Martinez, Marvin Crenshaw, Roy Williams, Al Lipscomb, Diane Ragsdale, and coalitions of Black, Latinx, Mexican American communities in Dallas to have equitable representation on city council, that the at-large system was overturned in 91, and we have the 14 district council that we have today. Took office later that year. And the system is not perfect by any means, but it is better than what we had. And we can't talk about Dallas without talking about the Klan. And particularly in the 1920s, the Klan was a period of increasingly visible white supremacy in Dallas. The Klan gained significant power across all branches of city government, be it from sheriffs to judges, district attorneys, and senators, all in the city. And Klan popularity spread throughout the city and was overwhelmingly supported by white Dallasites. Pictured here is Dallas dentist Hiram Wesley Evans. Because Dallas was the largest Klan order in the country, Evans gained national attention and eventually became the Grand Imperial Wizard of the Klan, leading the national organization. And another dark day in Dallas's history is Klan Day at the State Fair of Texas in 1923. There were 5,000 new members added to Klan Order number 66, Dallas's Klan Order. There are estimated to be about 75,000 spectators there for that ceremony, and there were several 100,000 attendees and present that day. And so while the Klan overwhelmed Dallas during most of the 1920s, many elite white leaders of the city became uncomfortable that racial violence was making Dallas appear too much like the Deep South, and they pushed this kind of widespread racial violence beneath the surface. Largely, a lot of efforts by the Dallas Morning News and other outlets like that tried to push this narrative beneath the surface. So let's talk a little bit about geography, redlining, and segregation. So early segregation efforts, again, 1906, this is the same year that the dissolution of the ward system occurred. Segregation in Dallas was instituted in public venues like schools, churches, and public parks and things like that. And Dallas became the first city in the state to adopt housing segregation policies in 1916. But municipal ordinances like Dallas's were overturned by the Supreme Court in 1917 in Buchanan v. Worley, which ushered in this new era of restrictive covenants. And in Dallas's ever entrepreneurial spirit, in 1921, Dallas City Council passed a law allowing residents of a neighborhood to request their block being designated black, white, or open. And residents of a neighborhood could request their block having that designation, which required a 3/4 vote by residents to change these, the racial designation. And so Dallas was kind of this always continually setting the precedent in the state of Texas for racial housing segregation. And as I mentioned, those city boosters could only keep the racial violence under wraps for so long. There are at least 3 prevalent attempts made over a 40-year period from the 20s, 40s, 50s, where bombings are carried out on Black homes when attempting to move into marginal white neighborhoods or into homes that are on the Black and white line. And if you want an excellent overview of racial politics in Dallas, I recommend picking up a copy of The Accommodation, which was recently re-released through Deep Vellum, and Commissioner Price has a very close connection to. So many of the visible elements of Dallas today are fundamentally shaped by this historical context. They're shaped by what is sometimes referred to as the racial geography of our cities, the foundations that the built environment stands on. So this invisible stage where politics and our lives play out. And these homeowners loan corporation maps have resurfaced recently in the wake of popular books like The Color of Law and brought a renewed interest in understanding the underpinnings of our cities, especially in the context of racial and economic exclusion. So for a quick recap on the meanings of the colors, red and yellow were considered hazardous for federally backed mortgages, and these ratings generally applied to Black, Mexican American, or Latin American or non-English speaking European immigrants. Blue and green areas were considered the most desirable from a mortgage lending perspective, and they were restricted to white neighborhoods, white English speaking neighborhoods. And so if we look at how this map has translated to present day Dallas, we can see that racial and economic segregation in Dallas today. This last map shows the distribution of low income and people of color in the city of Dallas today, and some of Dallas County as well. So areas with no shading are predominantly white and higher income. The yellow areas are above average low income, blue areas are above average people of color, and green are above average, both low income and people of color. So you can see how those blue and green areas are still largely unshaded today. And so those early segregation efforts have carried on, 80 years later. So these mechanisms of racially and economically segregating the built environment have shaped Dallas's residents of color for generations, with long-lasting effects from not only the visible design, like loan maps, segregated neighborhoods, and food and infrastructure apartheid, while also being shaped by invisible design, things like loan rates and access, land use burdens like concentrated air pollution, industrial zoning, and political representation and districting. So homeowners loan corporation maps are not the only invisible design element that shape our communities. Eminent domain, slum clearance, urban renewal, and even local land use and zoning influenced and continue to influence what is built, where it is built, and why it is built. And these policies, which control land use, function as surrogates for maintaining and shaping systems of civic and political power. Eminent domain is the use of federal power to take over land for public use. It's a constitutional right. And in Dallas's context, it was used to not only create highways through the middle of neighborhoods of color, but also to move people around so they were not present in areas making white people uncomfortable, like through building parking lots for the State Fair of Texas. If you want a good recap of that, I recommend getting a copy of the November issue of D Magazine. And in some instances, eminent domain functioned as a sorting mechanism, and it dispersed Dallas's Black and Mexican American neighbors from their homes and their neighborhoods. Slum clearance and urban renewal were federal programs to remove and improve what was called, quote, slum and blighted areas. They're most often used for the development of highways and public housing projects, which in Dallas's context took North Dallas's context, which we'll talk about in a little bit, took homeowners and turned them into renters. And in a country where owning land is a powerful factor in the political process, this can have massive ramifications for who controls shaping the built environment. And the word slum, I want to kind of camp out here for a second. So slums are created when infrastructure is underfunded, neighborhoods are overcrowded with people who have nowhere else to find housing due to formal or informal segregation. And then these campaigns are created that describe these areas in such a way that people begin to fear them and think that the only way to keep the disease from spreading is to cut it out like a cancer. And so words are incredibly powerful. And racist ideology is the world's best at using words to promote white control over not only people, but space. Zoning is a more local approach on defining how land can be used. Not all cities have zoning ordinances. Houston, for example, does not. But Dallas, like many other cities in the United States, have developed these zoning patterns where unwanted land uses are situated near low income or neighborhoods of color, burdening residents with loss of property value and right to a healthy life, like having a 150,000 ton mountain of shingles in the middle of a Black and Mexican American neighborhood in Dallas. So our BIPOC neighbors across Dallas are still fighting these invisible design elements today, and they're using neighborhood associations. They're standing up at city council meeting. They're using all these physical and civic infrastructure pieces to lead these grassroots efforts of taking back their communities. So I want to hone in on one neighborhood that is, for the most part, no longer visible, and that is the Freedmanstown, North Dallas neighborhood, which today is largely known as Uptown. So my journey into this work began with this Freedman Cemetery, located at the intersection of Lemon and Central Expressway. I was doing research for a paper on Central in one of my classes in the spring of 2020, and I stumbled onto this 1990s New York Times article detailing how 1,157 bodies of formerly enslaved people were being dug up and moved to make space for the expansion of the highway to what we see today. And many of those bodies were paved over during the original construction in 1949. And there was something so fundamentally wrong that we would prioritize the development of a highway over the eternal rest of Black bodies. And in my previous experience building pipelines, I knew what had to go into the kind of thing where you would dig bodies up. So I understood those ramifications and what it took to leverage that kind of power to make those choices. And that research continued to lead me toward other highways and other neighborhoods of color in Dallas with these similar stories of dismantling and erasure. It was pattern after pattern after pattern. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it anymore, and it's everywhere. And so today I've already discussed some of the political and infrastructure mechanisms that played into that erasure and those patterns. And now we'll cover the history of just one neighborhood that used to surround these graves in this North Dallas neighborhood. So the former Freedmanstown, North Dallas neighborhood was racially segregated and confined within this pink area you see here, most of which lies in the Arts District and Uptown today. The North Dallas neighborhood was bounded by McKinney and Pearl to the west, Lemon and Haskell on the east, and Ross on the south. On the western edge ended where Clyde Warren Park begins, and Clyde Warren Park is actually located on what used to be Little Mexico to the west of North Dallas. So North Dallas was settled in the late 1860s after emancipation. Formerly enslaved African Americans came to Dallas and began purchasing property just north of Dallas. It was originally called Freedmanstown and later designated as North Dallas. The infrastructure presence in the area began in 1872 when the Houston and Texas Central Railroad rolled into Dallas and cut through the eastern portion of the neighborhood and ran along the eastern edge of the cemetery. The railroad brought economic opportunity and a concentrated development around the tracks, which helped provide jobs and housing for North Dallas residents, and created areas called Stringtown, which built up alongside the tracks between North Dallas and Deep Ellum. And in terms of economic development, North Dallas had a heavy concentration of businesses along Hall Street. And just before Central Expressway was built in the late 1940s, there were 100 businesses on Hall Street alone. It was one of the economic hearts of Black Dallas at the time, along with Deep Ellum and the 10th Street neighborhood in Oak Cliff. And today there's only a fraction of that many businesses. I think on the north side, there's just a Walmart neighborhood market and a Cleaners. And I want to emphasize how self-sustaining these and other neighborhoods of color were. As historian Dr. Mamie McKnight said, all the books talked about slums and squalor. Those of us who grew up in these neighborhoods knew better. They were viable communities paid for and built by Blacks. And if you hear nothing else from this presentation, I want you to remember it is important to understand what narratives are continually portrayed, who is portraying them, and who benefits from that portrayal. It's these implicit and explicit narratives that are the cornerstones of perpetuating inequality. And while I won't spend much time on the broader neighborhood history in this presentation, I do want to briefly acknowledge some of the well-known businesses in the area. So the Pinkston Clinic, when it opened in 1927 with 15 beds, that was the only operating clinic open strictly to Black residents of Dallas, and only the third Black clinic to exist to that point. Dr. Pinkston was the first Black doctor in Dallas allowed to operate in a white hospital. The McMillan Sanitarium, just north on Hall Street, was the only place where Black surgeries could take place in Dallas. The State Theater was one of many Black theaters in the area. And the Powell Hotel, which D.H. Powell built, was a 40-room hotel where anyone who was anyone would stay when they came through town. And North Dallas was the largest Black neighborhood in Dallas at the time. Had around 16,000 residents by 1940, which is just a little bit more than are present in the area today. So to provide some visual context for what infrastructure policy and racism looked like historically in the North Dallas neighborhood, the Roseland Homes Public Housing Project was built in 1942. This is Hall Street right here in red. And this development was what residents described as the Highland Park of Black Dallas. It's a direct quote from the Dallas Express, Black newspaper. And it was a site that residents did not consider a slum. Hundreds of homeowners were either forced out of North Dallas or became renters. And as preparations for construction ensued a few years later, 1,500 residents lost their homes in the winter of 1946 to make space for construction. Central Expressway cut Hall Street in half, as you can see here, and it divided the neighborhood east and west. It was a literal and figurative wall in the community. As I mentioned earlier, Hall Street boasted over 100 businesses between Ross and State before the highway went in, before Central was there. And after Central came through, businesses began to shutter and move out along with the residents. But on the outside looking in, Central was heralded as this civic and infrastructure success. And it was built to primarily serve the white suburbs, saving them 5 to 15 minutes on a daily commute. I don't think that would be the case anymore today. Anybody who's driven Central recently. And all of this was at the expense of the livelihoods and housing of Black residents in the North Dallas neighborhood. And I want to read this quote from Lewis P. Head from the Dallas Morning News, 1925. He says, this plan, he was referring to the Kessler plan, which originally proposed the idea for Central. This plan would make Central one of the finest in the United States, and property now utilized for cheap industrial purposes or Negro residential districts would be changed into high-class apartment and retail business districts. And this was said in 1925. And 80 years later, this prediction came absolutely true. North Dallas was continued to be divided by highways and land development measures that made the area attractive to real estate investors, and the city of Dallas's vision for itself as a city moving forward. So the clearing for Woodall Rogers began in the late 1960s. And you can see it here, kind of that scar coming through the middle of the photo through the neighborhoods. And that land sat vacant for over a decade before construction began in earnest in the late 70s and early 80s. And it left a new barrier in the southern portion of the neighborhood, segregating Booker T. Washington, the Moreland YMCA, and churches from the rest of the neighborhood to the north. Development of the Arts District and the Uptown Public Improvement District in the 1990s began to change the names and faces in the area. And this is when the name Uptown came into being. The Public Improvement District made millions of dollars available for redevelopment. Roseland Homes was also partially torn down and replaced with fewer units that fit the aesthetic of the changing neighborhood. And this is a common pattern in Dallas's history, where the city of Dallas is interested, when there's somewhere that the city of Dallas is interested in developing, and these policy mechanisms become available to facilitate that development. And that's often at the expense of existing residents. And that's just what happened west of North Dallas in the Little Mexico neighborhood. That's happening now in West Dallas and Trinity Groves, and in the 10th Street Freedmanstown and Black Bottom neighborhoods in East Oak Cliff. So I drove past this cemetery hundreds of times going to Uptown, never thinking twice about that area or what it was. I often asked myself, why are these cemeteries in the middle of Uptown? And the question I should have been asking myself was, why are all these buildings surrounding these cemeteries? I was too focused on whatever was going on in my life to stop and wonder why these cemeteries were surrounded by that brand new development. And this is how I've interacted with neighborhoods across Dallas my entire life, very passively, not necessarily concerned about its history. And that's because Dallas was largely designed by and for people like me. And anything that might push against that dominant narrative of forward progress without reflection or reconciliation is often met with resistance. And this is why it is so difficult to fight for remembering our history when it is largely paved away and there's little left to point to. The last vestiges of North Dallas are easy to miss. There's just a few remaining North Dallas structures outside the State Thomas Residential Historical District. Booker T. Washington High School, St. Paul United Methodist, the Moreland YMCA, which is now home to the Dallas Black Dance Theater. So all of these buildings are still present, but they're very hard to find unless you know what you're looking for. And I'd like to end with this quote from Edward Soha, which beautifully captures this continual struggle of infrastructure, policy, and racism in Dallas and across the US and across the world. He says in his book, Seeking Spatial Justice, that space is not an empty void. It is always filled with politics, ideology, and other forces shaping our lives and challenging us to engage in struggles of geography. So as we go out today, remember to pay attention to the built environment around you, pay attention to those patterns that show up, and reflect on what that is communicating and what may have been paved away in order for it to exist, and how we can collectively pave a new way toward a more just and equitable present and future. Thank you.
I'm here breathless and trying not to impose my little 2 cents worth in. I'm going to bring in the professor, and then I'll jump back in, because I mean he's talked about so much, and especially when he talks about Fair Park. And I've been blessed enough to be here with the J.B. Jacksons of the world and the whole Fair Park Homeowners Association and the taking of that land. He talked about businesses in North Dallas. And the only thing I'm going to ask you to editorialize, Collin, is short North Dallas. We never called it.
Yeah.
We never called it North Dallas. It was short North Dallas when I got here from 40. The other cotton capital of the world, but nonetheless. So that and again, Washington Place, he talked about Roseland Homes, but Washington Place was another public housing unit that was taken down to make way for, you say, Baylor Scott and White or the Tom Landry Center, where Tom Landry Center was public housing. And we'll talk about William Sidney Pittman, the whole Knights of Pythian, and what happens, and how, you know, Booker T. Washington is not just a school. It was his daughter was here, his son, his only son-in-law was here, and their presence is still very much part of this community. So anyway, so Professor, Doctor, let you in here before I just get too excited.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And I understand that feeling of breathlessness. I think I've seen this presentation a couple of times, and it always invokes that reaction. So I'm not going to make too many comments, but I did want to step back a little and start to think about what Collin's work from a historical context means for the present. And much of the work that he did is happening now, right? He does make that point. But my comments are more of at the federal level. So as some are aware, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was signed in November 2021. Mm-hmm. And from a transportation perspective, represents the largest level of investment at the federal level since the Eisenhower highway era. So it creates many opportunities. It's $550 billion for infrastructure, and Collin did a great job of describing what physical infrastructure is. The bill made attempts to look at more than physical infrastructure, but the lion's share is going to go towards roads, streets, and bridges. And from a transportation perspective, that is perhaps hopeful, but I think given the context of Collin's work, that is also potentially unsettling, right? To recognize the potential for that level of investment, shrouded by this historical context of the way we use transportation in particular. But I think there's hope within the current IIJA bill. The Federal Highway has laid out guidance or a framework for how those dollars should be invested. And it has 7 or 8 points that it has laid out. But one of those key guidance points is about reconnecting communities and reflecting the inclusion of the disadvantaged and underrepresented groups in planning, project selection, and design. So there is this, I think, explicit desire to reconnect areas that were potentially paved away in the past, and to provide an opportunity to reconnect those communities. The Federal Highway Administration, I think, is very careful in the way they deliver guidance. It's not very prescriptive. They actually call it an overarching framework for how you should invest that money. You should focus on safety and resilience, prioritizing infrastructure that's vulnerable and might fall due to climate change, But it does not give us very explicit ways for how we should think about reconnecting communities. And so that work has to be done at the state and the local level. The executive order that was passed by the president on racial equity in underserved communities tells us that we want to think about core tenets that include advancing equity, civil rights, racial justice, and equal opportunity. And I think from a local level, the key question really is, what does equitable investment in historically underinvested and disinvested places look like? And I think each jurisdiction really needs to just kind of struggle with that question to think about ways to move forward. So what does it mean to have an equity promoting process? And what does it mean to have equity promoting projects? Right? I think Collin does a good job of kind of demonstrating what it shouldn't look like, but what it has looked like historically. And I think our key actions then are to, in our local spaces, identify historically disinvested places, and then also to set the goals and priorities that allow us to have equitable investment. And that's not an easy task, but I think one of the first steps is what Collin has allowed us to do today, is to look back and see what were the results of prior decision making, and to really reflect on how we can start to reconnect places that may have been paved away historically in the past, and to avoid that happening in the future. So Commissioner Price, I will let you get back to your local thinking.
I know I'm look like I'm perched, and I am. But thank you, Doctor, and Collin. You know, again, if you've just joined us, I told Collin I started out by talking about Black labor, white wealth, and he has taken Dr. Claude Anderson's work one step further. He basically talked about the separating of neighborhoods and the demise of those neighborhoods economically. It's interesting, and most people don't want to say this. This is my editorial comment. But look at DART. And when you look at the lines, DART coming through the African-American community, I mean, let's talk about Lancaster. You split Oak Cliff, you split the communities, and nobody talks about that. We talk about public transportation here again as a policy, but 40% of that southern area is transportation deprived. And so when you look at that, and then you look at the fact that somehow we've got the insertion of public policy that continues to divide neighborhood, it's an issue. Doctor, as you talked about, you know, one of the things I said about that $500 billion, and I think it's about 35 billion, it's supposed to come to Texas. You know, I call it AGC welfare. And again, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, the Association of General Contractors, it didn't surprise me that, you know, that the bill passed because, you know, the same people, the legacy firms, continue to design, they continue to be the benefactor, if you will, of these so-called infrastructure bills. And so it's interesting to me, and I know some other people probably want to talk. Black lives don't matter for me until Black economics matter. And he talked about a lot of pieces out in North Dallas. The reason the Blewett Flower is named after Dr. R.B. Blewett and Dr. W.J. Flowers, which is the first of the COPC, community primary care clinics, reaching into the communities, is because Dr. W.J. Flowers had a sanitarium in Short North Dallas there. The Flowers family, and of course, I've worked with them, and the Blewett family. Still, some of his relatives are still here. The Knights of Pythian building, down on what we call Deep Ellum. By the way, was designed by Booker T. Washington's only son-in-law, married Portia. They both lived here in Dallas, and he designed that building, and which now is called the Pittman Hotel. We got them to name that the Pittman Hotel. What's interesting about that is that Booker T. Washington told William Sidney, talk about supply chain. He said they will not sell you quality and deal with you in quality. So he sent William Sidney Pittman to Europe to learn how to make bricks. And so when we were able to tell them when they built that hotel that Mr. Pittman had made those bricks that's now in the facade on the Pittman Hotel. I just get too excited about this. So I'm gonna let somebody else talk, but the two of you have just, you've taken me to a level, and when they remove things from the landscape, again, I'm back to Tom Landry's center. That was Washington Street projects, which was tantamount to Rawson Home. Now, Rawson Home was a transition for so-called male workers and all. And as Collin talked about, when you get into Arlington Park and places like that, they were designed for a lot of, quote, black GIs returning. And I'm always interested when I hear the Dr. Hamilton and the Hamilton Park piece. I take another position with that, with regards to Hamilton Park, and watch Hamilton Park. Watch what's about to happen, how it has basically been enveloped, and with that whole TI piece. Okay, let me. Unless I know other people want to talk, and I'm going to try to hold my peace best I can. So, Alyssa, let's go and see who else wants to talk other than allowing me to just continue. By the way, Dallas was considered like Atlanta, was just like Black Wall Street. It was a mecca for African American community, and not only was this considered the #1 Klan headquarters destination, it was also the #1 John Birch Society designation, which I always say they go hand in hand, but that's a whole nother story. I know somebody else wants to talk. Alyssa, I'm gonna let you have it.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Yes, this has been a great, lively discussion. I know you talked in your book, Collin, about Deep Ellum, and Commissioner had just mentioned the popularity of Dallas being a mecca. Can you tell us about how the role that Deep Ellum played in that?
Yeah, especially when you use the words Black Mecca. Deep Ellum continues to have that that designation throughout history. It was such a lively entertainment district, shopping area. It was interesting because it was this place, this marginal space where the Black and Jewish communities could be together without kind of having anyone really say anything, which is this really fascinating place in Dallas where people could be, and it was okay to integrate to some respects. And so it's this incredible place just east of Dallas, and from an infrastructure perspective, Deep Ellum existed because the Houston and Texas Central Railroad and the Texas and Pacific Railroad intersected further east, and that's what gave this economic boom to the Deep Ellum area. So people moved over there, people built homes, and talked about seeing these patterns. The same thing happened to Deep Ellum that happened to Short North Dallas and all these other areas where you have these massively thriving, but highly segregated and highly deprived from an infrastructure perspective, like streets and all these other things, but also these narratives that played. And I remember this even growing up. I always, even in the 90s, Deep Ellum was a place of like crime, and we're seeing that narrative, being portrayed today. And so Deep Ellum, even back in the early 1900s, just had this negative connotation for just because it was a Black space. And so when you have Central come through, Central took out a lot of the area called Stringtown and segregated. It basically cut through just, I guess it'd be west of the Pythian temple that existed, at that time, and then you see the same pattern come through. So South Central Expressway, or I guess it was still North Central Expressway at that point, comes through there, segregates Deep Ellum from downtown, so it makes it harder. And then you see this other tactic of using one-way streets to show the most important thing is the flow of traffic through the area. And so that's what really puts this hole in the heart of Deep Ellum, is you have these patterns of separating off and then controlling traffic flow, because traffic was the most important thing to the city at the time, was getting cars into and out of the heart of the city into downtown at whatever cost possible, which decimated businesses. And so as you see like this decline in short North Dallas, people start moving away because the homes and the communities and the fabric is being destroyed. The same thing is happening in Deep Ellum because it was so dependent on that synergy of being so close to short North Dallas, being that mecca, that center of Black life in Dallas. And so you start to see this very similar turn in Deep Ellum. And then kind of the final nail in the coffin is I-345 being built, elevating the highway in the early 1970s. And in fact, they marched a coffin. The business owners of Deep Ellum marched a coffin down Main Street because they knew, they're like, this is going to be the death of our neighborhood. And it was. And it's interesting because the 10th Street neighborhood in Oak Cliff did a very similar thing a few years ago. They held a mock funeral for their neighborhood because it's being decimated by development. So you see these this use of it's like we're dying here, and it's the truth. Literally and figuratively, the neighborhoods are dying. So yeah, when you talk about these Black meccas, Deep Ellum was absolutely the heart of it. They called it Harlem in miniature, Black Wall Street, all sorts of things. So we've lost just an incredible amount of history and culture and economic wealth, Black wealth from the loss of these businesses that just hasn't recovered in the same areas since then.
Let me jump in, and you keep talking about Central Expressway, Collin. I talked about DAR a few minutes ago, but I want everyone who's on the call to understand then and even now the prominence that railroads have historically played with regard, because Central Expressway ain't nothing but Central Track. Okay. Right. Every community has some. I mean, one some larger than other. I tell people all the time, Frisco was a railroad town. We need to understand when you got that kind of, and even today, Class 1 railroads still basically rule the day. You can talk about all of the supply chain. You can talk about seaports, but at the end of the day, railroads are still playing a vital role in transportation and how goods, talk about trucking, but how goods get from point A to point B in this country and in these communities. Listen, I'm sure there's other people in the chat want to say something. I'm trying, Doctor.
Yes. Also, tell us more about, Collin, if you will, about the South Dallas Fair Park community history.
Oh gosh. It's kind of a loaded question. I'm probably less well versed in that history. In fact, Commissioner Price would probably be better able to speak to it, but I can at least speak about some of the I can at least speak on the expansion of the Fair Park parking lots. I'm better versed in that regard. So especially in the context of Fair Park, the neighborhoods surrounding that, which today Dolphin Heights is one of the neighborhoods we hear a lot about now, and even the Mount Auburn neighborhood to some respects as well. So in the 1960s, Fair Park was looking to expand, and in that context, they were looking to basically they hired the ERA, the Economic Research Association, which came out and did a study. They were trying to understand why white people weren't coming to the fair and why they weren't coming to Fair Park more often outside of the fair. And they did this whole study, and one of these quotes from we still have copies of this study today, and one of the quotes from one of the focus groups, they laid out this proposal that said, people were talking about, like, I don't feel comfortable. They're like, well, we shouldn't talk about the race problem, but you don't really feel comfortable going down there. So there's a lot of this coded language. Everybody like dancing around the fact that what they were talking about was like, we're uncomfortable because when we come to Fair Park, there's Black people in their homes, and that makes us uncomfortable. And so the ERA, the Economic Research Association, they laid out this proposal to this focus group, and they said, well, if we created this buffer, this paved parking lot, a lit parking lot, and a fenced parking lot, would that make you feel more comfortable? Basically, if we made it so that you didn't have to see Black people when you came down to South Dallas, when you kind of came down into this South Dallas area, would that make you feel comfortable? And there's this direct quote from the focus group. It says, all the respondents with a resounding response said yes. And so the city of Dallas at that time carried out this, and I don't have time to get into all the details, but essentially they used permitting to, they cut off permits to prevent improvements in the area so that people couldn't improve, which drove down land values. And then they used eminent domain to take over those homes and that property. And that couldn't be fought. Reverend Peter Jackson talks about this a lot when he came through. He told me, he's like, you couldn't win on eminent domain, but you could have. They fought on due process, saying basically that the city didn't follow proper due process. And so these homes where you have, say, 1,000 square foot home owned by a Black family, and then you have a house next to it where you have 1,000 square foot home owned by a white landlord in Highland Park, Park Cities, far north Dallas, kind of absentee landlords. The homes of the white owners were valued at, say $1 per square foot, and the homes of the Black landowners and homeowners were valued at a quarter. I think they eventually got it up to about 50 cents per square foot. But you had these massive discrepancies in eminent domain and condemnation valuations. And that's the story we see, is just this taking of land and taking of space to make white people feel more comfortable. And when we talk about Southern Dallas as a whole, you see now the city of Dallas just last year coming to a present context. The city of Dallas is finally saying, okay, we need to recognize that we haven't provided proper economic development and infrastructure funding in South Dallas. And so now all of our stuff moving forward is going to be focused in this area. So it's like now Dallas is taking this approach of, all right, we recognize we've really messed up. And we're going to try making these concerted efforts to start things like the Redbird development and other things. So we're starting to see this shift of moving away from policies where you had people's homes taken, businesses disruption, and this focus on making white people feel comfortable, to really trying to focus on developing and cultivating Black-owned businesses and creating Black wealth and more housing and more economic development in Southern Dallas in a way that just hasn't been done before. It's basically been neglected because we use the words slum. It's the reason that, for some reason, grocery stores think they can't make any money opening up south of 30. Like, there's nobody that lives south of 30 that would want to buy groceries, you know, all these things. So we're starting to see some of these changes in the ways that we perceive space, who's valued. And so hopefully that we'll start to see a change in tide in South Dallas.
Now,
Well-
Collin, I'm sorry, Commissioner.
No, go ahead on, Lisa, because all I was going to throw in there the Lower Peaks Branch piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lower Peaks Branch, and that was that flooding of homes
Yep.
in and around, which just buttresses the east side of the Fair Park. But so as they poured at that time, not more concrete, but even asphalt, that runoff continued to flood Lower Peaks Branch and those homes. And again, you know what that does, of course, in terms of value. I don't ever know if Lower Peaks Branch ever got that designation, but it was it was flooded. And and most people don't realize, again, coming to Dallas, I guess 40 years ago, 50 years ago, I guess. Wow. Anyway, there was a place called Roosevelt Heights. Same thing. It's off of 175 for those of you who just got to town, but Roosevelt Heights flooded every time it rained. I tell people, water flows south. And Roosevelt Heights, the only way we knew it was over there, we could see the boats floating. And it's interesting now to look at what they've done as they begin to build schools and build back in that area and that old levees and all of that area flooded. It's the history is rich. Continue, Alyssa. Just cut me off.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. I was going to ask if there are if you're seeing policies, Collin and Dr. Smith Collin, if you're seeing policy changes that incorporate more social justice into design of infrastructure. I'm noticing in my position that I'm seeing more recommendations or more programs that point to that, like, for example, the Envision program for sustainability. But I don't know if cities are actually changing their ordinance when it comes to development.
So I think, you know, some of your observations about recommendations are mostly correct. You know, as I pointed out, even Federal Highway has offered guidance. The work really has to be done at the local level, right? At the local level, we really have to decide how we're going to choose, whether we're going to choose to prioritize equity as an objective, and then to really think about what that means, right? And so the Commissioner Price really makes this point about, you know, economic equity, right, is very tied to questions about racial equity as well, right? But these can be separate and joint objectives that cities can take for themselves. But I think there has to be an explicit conversation. I think at the local level, many people are really wrestling with what should that look like and what can that look like. I do think the intent of the recommendations is to have changes in ordinance, in development, in, you know, rubrics that we use to prioritize funding and to award projects. I really do think that's the intent, and we have an opportunity to lead in that area. And I think studies have been shown that the benefits will reap rewards globally for us as a community and help to wrong or right rather the injustices of the past. And conversations like this are really the first step of many to getting there.
Thank you. We do have another question from the audience. It's from Carl Stundens. He says, I worked with Dallas redevelopment projects for years. Most of the land in many areas, State Thomas, Deep Ellum, portions of North Oak Cliff, Cedars, had been purchased by various private development groups by the time the city began its efforts. A lot of this land was purchased and the structures demolished way ahead of any market demand for the property. Can you expand on the role of these private developers relative to the infrastructure improvements and displacement?
Oh man, I think we could probably do an entire other meeting just on this question alone. And yeah, I mean, you raise a really, really good point. And in fact, if I jump back here to this, I think this highlights your question perfectly, because you see here on the right hand side, I think this photo was taken, Central still under construction. This is probably, I think this is late 90s that this aerial photograph on the right was taken. And you're right. You see these, you can see that this entire area over here on the right is just vacant. It's been wiped clean. There's nothing left, which is a stark contrast from what it looks like over here, the very dense kind of urban fabric. So yeah, once you have this decline in the neighborhood, you have that kind of that first domino falling in a neighborhood. And sometimes a domino doesn't necessarily have to fall. I think in the case of, in particular, West Dallas, right now, we're seeing a very similar story play out. I remember in the course of my research, and I didn't include a lot on West Dallas necessarily in this book, but I remember reading an article in D Magazine of the developers. I think it's West Dallas Development was the company, and they were talking about this new neighborhood they were trying to build in West Dallas. And many of the people living in West Dallas, the Mexican American neighborhoods, they migrated from Little Mexico after they were forced out of that neighborhood because developers were buying up plots of land and kind of pockmarking the fabric and kind of picking out parcels of land that destroyed like the communal knitting together of those neighborhoods. And so developers play a huge role in that, especially when it comes to the amount of power and the amount of money that is available, because a lot of times, not always, developers have significantly deeper pockets and a lot of money that comes with them. And so when they offer up, to purchase a parcel of land that for them is an inconsequential cost, relatively speaking, but for some of these families, it may be more money way more money than their home is worth, and more money than they may see. And I think particularly in West Dallas's context, just kind of talking from a very recent example, developers were buying up land with the express intent of creating wealth for themselves. I mean, these were direct quotes in the article. They're saying, we are buying this land so that we can make money because we see this as an investment opportunity and we see nowhere else for Dallas to go but west. And so we're going to start buying up all these lands. We're going to make our way into these neighborhoods, get cozy with the neighbors, and then start buying up land and start developing. And if you've been down Singleton anytime recently, you've seen that's exactly what has happened.
Collin, I'm going to jump in here. My 36 years ago as a commissioner, my first project, Alberta was here, was Singleton Boulevard. And I said then, when we began to widen Singleton Boulevard and watch what was going on with regards to the lead smelter piece and the reclamation. Again, here's that environmental piece, and I know you want to tie that in. But once the city jumped and created that footprint, we finished about the same time. I think they decided they were going to do Trinity Groves. It was a done deal. And the key word that you're missing about development is access. I mean, individual homeowners and all, and even those of us who would be small time investors, we don't have that kind of access. And it's interesting on Sylvan 30, my friend Bobby Lyle. When you talk about what's going on in that whole community, look what happened. And when I saw West Dallas, Fort Worth, anything that was just north of 30, Kessler Park, is as far as I was concerned, was West Dallas. You can call it Eagle Ford. You can call it whatever you want to. Pemberton Hill, whatever name you want to put on it. It was always in that I call it that destination scope of takeover. And I said that probably, like I said, 36 years ago. It was my number one project. I probably spent more time and more money on Singleton than anything. And now, we're beginning to see that there's no longer an affordable community. I happen to also be on Dallas Housing Acquisition Corporation, which is a land bank where the city is basically, banking land and supposedly developing, other people developing. When we do the bottoms, it's the same thing. Of the 500 properties that are in the bottom, most of them are city. And they begin to deal with the infrastructure. The manual is lighting, sewer, water, and a piece of it is in the floodplains. But where it's a foot in the floodplain or it's a little more in the floodplain, makes all the difference in terms of detention pond. I'm back to you engineers, Dr. Collins, you and Collins and Alberta. At the end of the day, infrastructure, public policy decides what's going to happen in terms of land use, and the bottoms will never be the community it was once intended to be. Lisa.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. We've had a lot of requests for contact information for Dr. Smith Collin and also Collin Yarbrough. So I've provided that in the chat. We're over time, and I know a lot of people need to get on with their day. So I just wanted to wrap this up and mention that next month we're going to meet for CETA, our annual CETA meeting, and we're looking forward to having that be in April, and we'll provide more information later as the date gets closer, but it's scheduled currently for April 21st. Going to be virtual at noon on that day. So that's what it stands right now. Alberta, Commissioner Price, do you have any further remarks?
I'll yield to Alberta.
Well, I just want to, I jumped here a little late before I could actually talk to Collin and Dr. Smith Collin. I'm on a board with you. I mean, I've been on the advisory board at SMU, so I've met you before. So I'm very glad to have you here as part of our guests as well. But I'm a fellow Dallasite as well. So I grew up in this community. And again, I do know about as Commissioner Price said, short North Dallas, and all of us Dallasites who call South Dallas what it is around Fair Park, South Dallas. So we all know, and I always feel that if you don't know your history, then you will make the same mistakes. And I think us as engineers need to know our history and how we look at design and how we look at planning and how we look at infrastructure. It will make a big difference on what we do in the sense of understanding the communities that we provide infrastructure, because infrastructure is a good thing. It's a powerful thing. Commissioner says all the time, you know, you say economics, I mean, transportation leads to economics all the time. And we're seeing that happen in all those areas that we're building out infrastructure. So we need to be smart engineers and smart planners and understand our communities that we're providing this work for. So I really appreciate you coming to this forum to give us that education.
And just thank the both of you for your courage. You know, you can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you don't put it out there and back it up, it doesn't mean anything. And so just thank you for your courage. Dallas is a rough city. I know people normally, but Dallas is a rough city, and we've seen that with the reissuing of the accommodation, and so thank you for your book. Thank you for all that you continue, and thank you Public Works and Lissa, as always, for bringing us critical, and it ain't theory. It's critical. It's critical. That's all I'll say. So if it's nothing else, anything else, Lissa?
No, I think that's it.
You thought I was going to say critical race theology. Anyway, okay. So since I didn't say any of that, thank all of you so much. Thank all of you for joining us. And we'll see you next month with Cedar. And we need to make this available to more than just those who are on the call. Okay?
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you all. Thank you, Collin, Doctor. Until
Thank
then,
you.
be safe.
Thank you.
Okay.
You too.
We're adjourned.